Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Shannon Derejo from Creamer Media's Contract Publishing. Welcome to today's webinar on upgrading infrastructure for economic growth, hosted in strategic partnership with the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Thank you to our sponsors, M&D Construction and RMB, for their support in making this webinar possible. Before we begin, please be aware that we have enabled the Q&A function, so please post any questions into the Q&A box. You'll find this on the panel at the bottom of your screen. If time permits, the panelists will answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the discussion. To encourage interaction, we have also enabled the chat function, so you can network with the panelists and other attendees via the chat box. You'll also find this at the bottom of your screen. Please do not, however, post any questions in the chat box, as we may miss them. Post those into the Q&A instead. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar and will be sending the recording to you when it's available. We are also streaming the webinar live to YouTube, and we'll share the link in the chat once it's available. Today's webinar will be facilitated by John Matthews, Chairperson of Construction Alliance South Africa. He holds the position of Group CEO of the Garden Cities Group of Companies. His areas of interest include the provision of housing and other social services to uplift the people of South Africa in a sustainable manner. John will facilitate the discussion with our panel, which consists of Portia Derby, CEO at Transnet, Zef Nhleko, Chief Economist at the Dbsa, Keta Rantau, Head of the Infrastructure Finance Units at the Infrastructure Fund, and Judy Querbis, Co-Head of Infrastructure Finance at RMB. We look forward to an engaging webinar. I'll hand over now to our facilitator, John Matthews, to set the scene and take the proceedings forward. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. The panelists have been introduced, so it's made my job a bit easier. I think we just need to make sure that we understand developing infrastructure for growth, and in terms of what it entails and what we are trying to achieve. So different aspects of infrastructure include housing, energy, transportation, information technology, water and sanitation. And I think each and every aspect of variable within that sphere is obviously much needed within our country. I think we could sit here for much more than an hour discussing all aspects, but for the purposes of this webinar, we are going to concentrate our efforts on the professionals that we have here today, and they are going to be giving us insights into what their viewpoints are with regard to infrastructure development. So please bear in mind that the Infrastructure Development Act was enacted in 2014, and that is 7 years ago. And I think we need to keep that in the back of our minds to understand whether we have progressed, whether we have gone backwards, or whether we have been static in the last few years since 2014. We are well aware of the current backlogs in electricity, transport, and water infrastructure, and the threat they pose on our growth and development. The importance of the reform, we need to understand the importance of the reform enabling embedded generators of up to 100 megawatt to proceed without a license, and whether the unbundling of Eskom and the formation of an independent transmission system and market operator will be sufficient to ensure the necessary pace and scale of investment in grid infrastructure. The question is also whether to move to establish Transnet National Ports Authority as an independent business and help attract much needed port investment, and whether South Africa's freight logistic infrastructure is sufficient to support commodity exports. And my favorite, of course, and I've been punting this for a very long time, I believe that the spend on infrastructure would act as a catalyst to unlock unemployment and the creation of jobs, which we really probably need to have another webinar about. So without further ado, let's dig right into the question and answer session. And I'm going to ask my first question to Portia Derby from Transnet. And the question to you, Portia, is what in Transnet's estimation is the investment backlog across the freight logistics system in South Africa? And what role do you foresee for both Transnet and the private sector in addressing these backlogs?
Good morning, John, and the panelists, and also to the people on the webinar. It's huge. What we have, if you look at freight on the track, and I'm going to focus on track, and I'm not going to talk about rolling stock, and I'll come back to why I'm not talking about rolling stock. On track signaling, substations, and everything like that, it's close to 100 billion over the next 7 years. The challenge that we have is that as we indicate that 100 billion, we're holding, assuming ceteris paribus when it comes to the issue of cable theft. And that's a huge problem, as you would know. It's a huge problem not only for Transnet, Eskom, Telkom, the municipalities. Recently, we've started also working with AXA on the same to deal with this issue. So if we don't deal with that issue, I don't know how big the hole is, because it's a constant growth. In that 74 billion, in our case, there would be a significant amount, which is just about bringing the chunk, the track back to design. Now, that doesn't include the amount of money that, as operators of the system, we would all have to spend for rolling stock. If you're on rail, that's ourselves, and whatever third parties who would come onto the system have to spend. So the amount of investment that we all have to undertake over the next couple of years is actually quite massive. Infrastructure investment that we've done is huge. And its stimulation effect is quite significant. I've not included the investments that are going to be taking place around at the ports in South Africa, both starting at Richards Bay, right around effectively, in fact, and we even seriously looking at fast-tracking the development of Bochubai as well, because that's really important for the Northern Cape, for opening up the Northern Cape, number one. Number two, frankly, we also need to get additional capacity so that we can move Black junior miners who would just have been struggling to move. So the opportunity is massive, and it's not a game that's only available to Transnet. It's Transnet as well as the private sector players as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That obviously leads to another question, and possibly Zeph, you can come in here, because I think it leads to the issue of, yeah, it's a huge spend. The Development Bank of South Africa is a bank. Hopefully they've got money. And the question then to the Development Bank of South Africa is, certainly from this perspective, is what are the key instruments that the Dbsa is deploying to support government strategy of placing infrastructure at the heart of the economic reconstruction and recovery plan, and ensuring that projects are obviously bankable? I think that's important, because we can't, nobody just throws money at a problem, that they are certainly green and sustainable, and then have a community buy-in. And I think by that, it's possibly, Portia was talking about 74 million, and I'm sure there's a lot more than that, just for the basic infrastructure. What is your viewpoint in terms of supporting and underpinning those processes?
John, thank you, and morning to you, the panelists, and everyone. The obvious tool is the incubation of the infrastructure fund, and I'm not going to talk about that. Kate, my colleague, is here, and she will deal with that. But John, over and above the traditional on-balance sheet and project finance instruments that we have, our approach to infrastructure development instruments is looking at three issues. This is now in the post-lockdown environment. We like to see it as part of the alternative funding sources structure. We want to see it as part of the high impact lending, but we also want to see it as part of empowerment support in the space. So one of the alternative sources of funds that we have adopted after the capital markets, started dislocating right at the beginning of COVID-19, is to set up a green bond framework. And we have successfully raised 200 million euros in April, and another 3 billion rands last October. So this is an important part of the tools, because if you don't have the funding, as you correctly say, it becomes difficult to get involved in funding infrastructure. The high impact approach that we took, on the other hand, it focuses on funding innovative, complex infrastructure development processes and the like. So an example I can give you there is high-risk infrastructure technologies, for example, new initiatives that we put in place, as well as pilots that we see as important in the space. We've already dispersed more than 390 million in this regard. And in this same space of high impact, we are also investing in what we call development laboratories, or DLabs, as we call them. These are development hubs that we set up in township and rural areas where we set up physical infrastructure, to support skills development, to support enterprise development, and to create market opportunities for the businesses. We've already spent over 20 million on 4 of such hubs in Soweto, in Alexander, in Westridge, in Lowsburg. And we've also, you will remember, we've issued a call for proposals for the embedded generation last year. This 100 megawatt issue that you're talking about. And we've already shortlisted more than 33 of these proposals. And if you talk about empowerment, we've introduced 2 new products. One, to support small and medium enterprises working capital, and the other one to partner with SME-oriented DFIs to support, to have a facility that supports SMEs. So there's a lot that's happening, John. One of the exciting things here is that we're doing all this in a manner that is sustainable in terms of the investment. So we overlay our credit process with our just transition, statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zef. I think I am seeing some questions coming up, and we will look at them in a few minutes. But let's just we have left some space for Q&As at the end. So let's just, the rack being racked up here, we are keeping a tight sort of watch on them. Keta, I think Zef he's passed the ball to you in terms of talking about the Incubation Fund. He's mentioned it right at the beginning of his introduction there, and he's been talking a lot about projects within communities and talking about SMEs, and obviously that directly relates to unemployment, and certainly that's where we have a challenge as well. And I want to pose the next question to you. Perhaps you can just give us a small introduction in terms of understanding what the Incubation Fund is that he's talking about, and then given the high level of unemployment that we have in our country, will there be policies to favor labor-intensive methods in infrastructure investment, or will this not be the main priority? And obviously that question stems from, there must be, I'm sure there's a link between the Incubation Fund issue and unemployment, and exactly some of the issues that Zef has raised in terms of the work that's being done within communities. Perhaps you can just expand a little bit on that. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and good morning to the panelists and to everyone else online. So from an infrastructure fund perspective, what Zef has mentioned is absolutely correct. The fund was announced by President Ramaphosa, it was in 2018, and a memorandum of understanding was signed in 2020, I think it was last year, possibly 2019, between the Dbsa, National Treasury, and the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure. So it's quite a new fund, which has been set up and is incubated at the Dbsa as a separate entity within the Dbsa. So we see ourselves as separate and unique to the Dbsa. Now, there is literature, tons of literature that supports government strategy to use infrastructure investment as a lever to kickstart the recovery of our economy. And to do that, government needs to roll out public infrastructure. There's about $1 trillion worth of projects across various public organs that do need to be rolled out. However, the fiscus is constrained, and so government alone is not going to be able to fund these projects. And that's where the partnership with the private sector comes in, and hence the birth and the genesis of the Infrastructure Fund. It is essentially meant to act as a bridge between the public sector and the private sector, where we help organs of state, be it at a national level, at a local level, at a municipal level, even SOEs, to bring their various projects to bankability so that they are palatable to the private sector. And then at the same time, we onboard private sector money into these projects and enable the rollout of these infrastructure projects. So we're looking to do it as fast as possible in accelerating infrastructure delivery, value for money at cost-effective rates, and then obviously using as much private money as possible. So government is looking to not tap into the 100 billion that's been set aside. So that's the Infrastructure Fund. And in so doing, right at the top of our agenda, John, is unemployment. And so, yes, there are various policies in the form of the National Development Plan, Vision 2030. There's also the ERRP, which is the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, which speaks to using labor-intensive methods in the delivery of such infrastructure. I mean, you'll appreciate that unemployment is at a critical level now. In this country, it's actually a crisis. It was at critical levels prior to COVID. And so government is looking to match its response to the level of, to the crisis, basically. So absolutely what you will see over the next coming years is more labor-intensive delivery. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Keta. Your comment on public versus private is key, I suppose, to try and get some cohesion between the public sector and the private sector. Quite right, government can't do it alone. I think we know that, and vice versa too. So my next question is posed at Judy from RMB, and I think the question is really understanding how the private sector can get involved. You know, with the infrastructure, obviously. So really, there's been a lot of debate about my next question, and perhaps you can give us shed some light on it. And this is with regard to regulations, such as Regulation 28, as we know, of the Pensions Fund Act, to mandate that a portion of the country's pension savings be directed the way of social and economic infrastructure. Now, we're fully aware of what the challenges are there. It is, if somebody wants to tamper with my pension, it gets very emotive. But I'm certainly going to hand over to you to perhaps get your comment from a banking and a financial perspective. Over to you, Judy.
Okay, thanks, thank you. Good morning to everyone, my fellow panelists, and also to the audience at large. I think I'll first start by tackling the question around how does the private sector get involved? Given how big the issue is around infrastructure delivery in SA, it is important that both public and private sector work together. So it's not just the responsibility of the public sector to deliver infrastructure. That said, the private sector now increasingly is playing a more prominent role before the projects even come to market. And the reason for this is because we have a fiscally constrained government, and there is a requirement for innovation in terms of the structures that we put in to fund infrastructure. So typically infrastructure was funded by structures that relied heavily on government guarantees. That's a thing of the past. So we are encouraged with the work that Keta and her team are doing around finding blended financing models to deliver infrastructure. To move on then to the second part of your question around regulations, regulations play a critical role in delivery of infrastructure. You mentioned briefly, John, in your introduction that the increase to 100 megawatts has opened up the ability for the private sector to deliver embedded generation. we can already see very much, very increased levels of activity around that, led in particular by intensive energy users looking to have their own generation capacity. Looking at Regulation 28 in particular, I don't think necessarily the individual should be concerned, because the regulation basically says, opens up for pension funds to put in more of those funds into infrastructure, to invest in infrastructure. This then would result in more capital being available for infrastructure projects, which then should lead in time to a lower cost of financing, so a lower cost of delivery of infrastructure. So in the end, it actually works out for everybody. I mean, more needs to be done around regulations. I'd particularly say that in terms of Treasury Regulation 16, which looks to, which governs how PPPs in particular, so public-private partnerships, are delivered. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there in terms of simplifying that regulation. As we know, we do have a capacity problem in delivering infrastructure. So the more simpler we make regulations, the more we actually increase the number of projects that we can deliver at any point in time. So to answer the questions, regulations are increasingly important, but it's important in looking to reform our regulations that we look to simplify them such that it doesn't take us, let's say, 3 to 5 years to get a project from project preparation to financial close, and that we can expedite that process to deliver infrastructure at scale.
Thank you for that. I am looking at the questions, and I'm not sure if the panelists are looking at them. There are 1 or 2 interesting questions which I'm going to bring back to Portia. Portia, the question that talks about what strides or strategy has Transnet formulated to date for the multimodal transportation to serve as a key vehicle to the African Continental Free Trade Area? Makes a comment that road is not alone. So I don't know if you can comment on that. And obviously the second issue that's been asked is, what is the anticipated timeline to give rail network access to private sector?
The first question, I'm a little bit of a simple woman myself. I mean, so what's the question that you're asking, really asking on the first question?
I think it's asking what strides or strategy has Transnet formulated to date for the multimodal transportation to serve as a key vehicle to the continent, I suppose. Are there any other strategies in terms of from Transnet with regard to the wider beyond South Africa?
I still don't quite understand the question, so I'm going to answer the question that I understand out of that. I'm not sure I'm answering the right question.
That's fine.
Rail has fallen to about 20% of total cargo movements in South Africa. I imagine that the same disastrous situation has also arisen into SADC. So for me, the issues which I think stand us in good stead is, however, is the fact that we've got the same gauge into, frankly, up to the DRC. We are basically on the same gauge. There are no issues around gauge. There may be the issues which makes life really complicated is AC/DC that you have to deal with. But then, you know, if you're running diesel, that's not really a problem. The issue is all of us from South Africa right up north, and I'll stop in the DRC for obvious reasons, right? We all have underinvested in infrastructure. So we've all got significant speed restrictions and the rest of the like, which means that rail is not as efficient as road. So there's a significant amount of work that we all need to do to get the track up to speed so that we can be able to have genuine interoperability, which is a loco that comes from the DRC, from the utility in the DRC can run right through to the port in Durban. That is life-changing and life-altering. Now, by and large, the positioning, we're not responsible for rail policy, right? So that's the question really that should be asked to DOT. But as far as we are concerned as Transnet and TFR, we've already sort of like started working on how we would create an enabling environment that would allow third-party access to the system because we need lots and lots of money to be able to upgrade, as I've already sort of indicated. So the issue of rebalancing the movement of cargo between road and rail, absolutely important. But then we also, frankly, on the continent, most of the smaller manufacturing, agriculture, and agriculture in particular, have always moved on roads. So one of the big pieces of work that we've been doing in Transnet, and I'm not quite at liberty to say at this stage, but soon and very soon, we are talking a lot more to the LSPs, the logistics providers, particularly around how we might work together, because they are genuine cargo consolidators. And we might be able to increase the utilization of rail. You know, some of the issue around security and safety and cable theft definitely have an impact. And in fact, it's unfortunate that actually it's a significant impact in terms of system design, because there's no running away from the fact, though, if you're in manufacturing, your cargo is going to reach the port at the expected time, especially if you're going to be exporting it. So there's no getting away from that requirement. So until such time, I think that we can deal with the theft, because if we deal with the theft, we at least have reliable rail, even if it's slow. So then it then becomes an issue of using, and those of you who have been following the investments that are happening in KZN, there's a lot of money that's going into backport caterage, you would know as a big dry port that they've worked on. And also we ourselves are looking at releasing parcels of land that we can make a storage, so that you can then hold stock at the port whilst you're waiting to move it out. So there's a lot that we're doing to enable that takes into account the state of infrastructure. I mean, Judy has just indicated this issue, and I think all of us understand that it's not only the state, and I mean, it's Transnet, we've been pretty upfront about the state of our balance sheet. And so the issue of bringing in private sector participation on operations is definitely helpful for us in terms of starting to earn additional revenue on the system that we do have.
Thank you. Thank you, Portia. I think you've answered the question in a fantastic manner, because I think you've all encompassed it. Zef, I'm going to ask you, and I want to bring up this issue of theft. I think we simplistically put people steal because they need to eat. I mean, that's very simplistic, I know that. And one of our problems and real challenges that we have, and particularly in the construction industry, is that we need to create jobs. That's as plain, as simple as it is. You can't tackle theft in isolation and say, we got to solve the stealing. There are other underlying factors that we need to address. So my question to you is, and I'm sure you are you concerned about the fact that South African construction sector has been decimated over the past decade due to the underinvestment in infrastructure? And we don't have to go into the history of it. We know that is a fact, that we haven't been able to act as catalyst, which is one of the issues that we've been advocating. And certainly from my perspective, we've been advocating, get these projects unlocked. We've got a whole list of projects, but we're not getting them unlocked. And my question is, in that context, is what should be done to rebuild the sector, and will we be increasingly reliant on outside contractors? And outside contractors, obviously, we talk about foreign contractors. So I'd like to hear your perspective on that, please.
John, this situation is worrisome. If you look at the average growth rate in the construction sector in the 9 years to 2019, it was only a third of what it was in the 9 years before 2010. And this number is even smaller if you include the 2 COVID years. So from a capital formation point of view, we are back at levels last observed in the 1940s. But I want to bring this, if you look closer at the numbers, particularly construction numbers, you realize that there's an interplay between economic and social infrastructure development, as well as between large and small contractors. In 2012, for example, small and medium contractors contributed 39% to the construction sector as a whole. but by 2019, they were contributing something like 58%. So our own experience suggests that there is still a lot of skill and talent in the small and medium contractor category. We, for example, have supported more than 1,030 small contractors last fiscal year. And similarly, if you look at the public spending in social infrastructure, this has increased, let's say, from 15% in 2011 to around 29% by 2019. So I'm trying to demonstrate that, yes, there's that decimation that you're talking about, but there has been some bright pockets within that. So at this point, we see 4 issues that must be addressed to try and support the rebuilding process in the construction sector, but also in the infrastructure development as a whole. The first one is that infrastructure development as a process, we need to reform the way we approve infrastructure projects. You can't have a single point of approval for the whole year. We need to increase the frequency of approvals, if, of course, we are arguing an infrastructure-led economic recovery. Secondly, the project pipeline that we have, it needs to be developed on a continuous basis, but you need to support this from a preparation point of view. In other words, the funding flow for project preparation needs to be visible, not just in budget speeches or in other talks, but it needs to be visible. The third point is the small and medium contractors, in our view, they have to be supported financially and otherwise to make sure that they participate in the sector, to make sure that local entities have got opportunities to participate, to grow jobs, etc., etc. And finally, and this is perhaps one of the important points, is that the capable state entities, they need to be utilized as agents for achieving government development goals. In other words, government must use these entities for what they were created for. And that is to help government deliver on some of these things. You can have a situation where allocations and transfers are done and then they're reversed, and done and they're reversed. We need to do some things differently. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Zef. Keta, I'm going to ask you just to perhaps add to that, and in the context of what Zef was saying, he mentioned this support mechanism for SMMEs and for smaller contractors and companies that we need to underpin those smaller organizations to provide the growth. And I'm just going to ask you the question: given the high level of unemployment in South Africa, are there currently, or will there be policies to favor labor-intensive methods in infrastructure investment? And should it or should it not be, from your perspective, a main priority?
Thanks, John. So I think we touched on that question a little bit in the previous, at least the last answer that I provided. So maybe I'll expand a little bit on it. But prior to that, I'll begin with responding to the first question around how do we support SMMEs and give them the opportunity to thrive in the current economy. So from an IDA perspective, which also then filters through to what the Infrastructure Fund does, to what Dbsa does, and to what various public bodies do as far as infrastructure delivery is concerned, we are required to prioritize giving opportunities to your smaller firms. That said, there is a tension around how you achieve that if you are looking to bring in private money. and Judy touched on it in her first response. So from a banking perspective and a private capital provider perspective, they often look for entities that have a track record, that have a balance sheet big enough to underpin the size of the project that we are looking to roll out. There are various requirements that I think Judy's probably better placed to talk to than I am. And that in itself is a filtering mechanism, because it leaves out a lot of these smaller entities that you are referring to. And so from a government perspective, we are cognizant, and acutely so, that the fiscus is constrained, so we can't support the sector on our own. We need the private sector to come alongside us. And that speaks to the innovation that Judy spoke to around the private sector rethinking and going back to the drawing board around risk mitigation, what type of risks they can take to help us alongside employment, improving unemployment rates, to help us onboard some of these smaller firms and give them an opportunity as far as taking on construction projects from the construction phase. I mean, what we've seen typically in the past, which is not palatable to these smaller firms, is them getting subcontracts from the bigger guys. I think they're looking to have their own contracts where they are the main contractor. And so my parting shot here is that it's not something government can do alone. It's something we need the private sector to help with. So that's the one. And then just to go back to unemployment, as I said previously, unemployment is one of the most important things that government is looking to improve, simply because following COVID, the inequality has widened, poverty has deepened, and we are seeing the implications of unemployment. I mean, if we looked at the unrest that happened last year. And so I re-emphasize that there are policies in place, frameworks in place that govern and call for labor-intensive methods. And so again, my call to the private sector is, the private sector has been known for being capital intensive, using machinery and the latest technology and AI and whatever else that's coming on board is known to be cheaper and to be less stressful and to roll out things a lot faster. And we're asking that that is re-looked at, given government's policy to improve the unemployment rate. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, John.
Okay, Keita, so you've unwittingly opened Pandora's box, because your comments are spot on. When you talk about smaller companies having to be under the supervision of bigger organizations, yes, that's fine, that works. But the real opportunities come when those smaller companies are given real jobs in terms of directly working for clients. And that is a very, very difficult concept. And certainly in my experience, we've certainly had to be dealing with that as well. And that it becomes even more difficult when those smaller companies apply for finance. And Judy, I'm well aware that you're not here to present the banking sector, but you work for a bank. So I've got to ask the question, because the risks are much higher. We know that. We know the returns could be higher, but the reality is all about the risks for the banks. And an example of that is where banks, and I know, we finance certain things and the bank said, no, but we don't want your money back. We'd rather give you a lower interest rate because we know you're a good client. Meanwhile, smaller companies are not even able to obtain finance or are able to obtain finance at really much higher interest rates, which obviously creates a lot more risk for them as well. There is a question in this, and the question to you, Judy, is what are the banks doing to mitigate that and to assist the smaller organizations in order to create the employment? And then maybe at the same time, I'd like to cover a question which came from certainly from the attendees, and that is, mostly when we look at infrastructure development, it is only concentrated on urban areas. And what is your viewpoint in terms of rural areas? Because this is the whole problem with urbanization. And then we struggle with trying to have resources at urban level. So it's a two-pronged question. If you could deal with that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So John, I mean, I'll start with where Keta left off. I think that the issue around having large construction companies being the entities that banks are more comfortable to deal with when gearing infrastructure deals stems from the risk allocation around PPPs. So typically what we would find is that the procurement of PPPs or infrastructure does also require, over and above just delivering the infrastructure, does also require that the private sector takes a lot of risk. So the risk of that infrastructure is fully transferred to the private sector. Now, depending on how big the infrastructure project is, and as we've said, I mean, to have economic growth and large scale employment, we need to do large, particularly economic infrastructure projects. And those projects usually require quite a lot of construction. So there's a big CapEx component and a big risk transfer component that's linked to it. So the ways that we can facilitate maybe smaller construction companies playing there is that firstly, the procurement docs need to maybe not be so heavily weighted on price. So what we're finding is when procuring infrastructure, the procuring documents basically choose a preferred bidder largely based on the price that they bid. And then that's typically about 90%. And then 10% is for all the other economic development requirements, which would include, let's say, local content, local community participation. So then the price point then requires that the larger entities that are able to wear that risk, basically play in that space. And therefore, in terms of considering bankability as well, we would also look then to the large entities. I think that it is important then for the procurement docs to compel the private sector to not just include smaller organizations, but to develop smaller organizations. So enterprise development, I think in particular, should be a bigger component in awarding projects. And also the other thing that we found has a big impact is when we've got a pipeline that is a project pipeline that is predictable and that is large, and that we've got a track record of that government has delivered against it. We find that maybe in the first rounds of the programs, you might need to include maybe the larger construction companies, which we don't have a lot, to be quite honest, and then also the international construction companies. But then as the rounds get more and more, we find that then we capacitate the local guys to become bigger, and in the subsequent rounds that they can play a much more meaningful role. I mean, a good example of that is the renewable energy IPP program, where we are seeing now local entities playing the developer role and playing important roles in terms of the construction and the operations and maintenance of those projects. In terms of the second part of the question around rural versus urban development, I think that when you look at the infrastructure that has been delivered over the last decade, it has largely been in rural areas, because the infrastructure programs that we've been working on over the last decade has been around the renewable energy IPP program. And you find that the best resources, so wind resource, solar resources, are actually located in rural communities. So you'll find that there's a lot of development around the Northern Cape in particular, in terms of solar, and a lot of development around the Eastern Cape in terms of wind. And the thing that's nice about how those programs were structured is that local enterprise development and local socio-economic development was key in terms of how those projects were procured and structured and delivered. And to date, there is a percentage of the revenue line that is generated from those projects that get given to the local community in terms of developing certain projects and developing the community in many ways. But I think more can be done. But it first starts with us also being cognizant of the priorities. And I think Keta alluded to this, and Portia as well, that the country has, that maybe in the first couple of rounds, maybe price is the priority, and also maybe the fact that the government is fiscally constrained. That is what we prioritize. But as we deliver more and more of these projects, I mean, then we are able to really get into the more social elements of the project, and also develop the local construction market as well. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Eddie. Portia, there are a couple of questions that are coming in here, and I'm just going to try and summarize them because it would be impossible to get to all the questions. But really, one of the issues that I've been wondering about in terms of Transnet is to say that we know that there is talk about privatization and getting the private sector involved into Transnet in terms of funding, etc. And some people describe this privatization, or some people claim that this process could possibly be privatization by stealth. So my question is that a fair comment, that when the private sector become involved in various forms, perhaps through the back door, is it a fair comment to say that it is privatization by stealth? And what can we do to ensure that we avoid a situation where freight logistic costs are carried by society, but the profits accrue to the private companies? So I hope I've made that question clear for you to answer.
So John, I'll start on a light yet serious note. Your backdoor statement is a problem with the Zondo report out there. So there's no backdoor, there's front door. So let's start here. I mean, it's such an issue that in South Africa we like labeling, and we're labeling in a way which is convenient to us. And if somebody says that it's privatization, what is privatization? Privatization is a wholesale exit of the state from something, and there's nothing of that sort. So the argument that we've gone in for is that it's clear that we have a mixed economy, and we're not the only country that has a mixed economy. Frankly, most of the globe has got a mixed economy of one sort or the other. Some of the differences that we have is that, unlike in the EU, where the EU directives help ensuring that actually governments subsidize infrastructure directly through fiscal transfers, is a thing we don't have in South Africa, at least on the rail side. On freight, it has to pay full costs for the infrastructure and for service. And that's important because having paid the full cost, it then also has to be able to transport our manufacturers, agriculture and mining, and ensure that we still are able to compete globally. Now, that's not a cross that only Transnet can bear. It's just a fact of life, is that as a system, these are policy decisions that have been taken. So what are we as Transnet doing? We're doing what any company would do. In certain areas, we need partners who may have skills that which we don't quite have at present. So if you look at every single transaction that we've put on the table, we're exiting nothing. However, we're bringing in partners to operate that with us. I'll use the example of Ngqura container terminal. That was designed in that port as that container terminal was always supposed to be a transshipment hub. Transshipment hubs, by their nature, are about getting somebody as a partner who has the cargo now. What we're betting on, and we're working with Ngqura Development Corporation on this, is that whoever transships through South Africa, and in all things, as the Buddhists say, all good, right? The pandemic has created its own problem, but it's created an unusual opportunity. Just the other day, we're in just-in-time logistics. Now we're in just-in-case logistics, right? So everybody's got to de-risk themselves from being held up in one country only. So we're betting on the fact that whoever we get into that deal would be able to have cargo that is value-adding cargo, where you can do final assembly. Now, not all final assembly is high value, but it's definitely higher value than when you're breaking bulk and splitting and redistribution to other regions. But you can't scoff at anything. not in the state that we're in. So clearly, in our case, the partnerships are about growth. They're not at all about exiting. I agree 1,000% with the sentiment that is being expressed, is that what you often see in some triple Ps, and that's why triple Ps are actually really hard, is that the risk-reward divide is never equitable. The risk stays with the state and the reward goes to the private sector. And that's why we are not in any shape or form exiting. Now, I do want to sort of like reverse that a little bit to some of the points that Keta was making. I mean, I can't disagree with that at all. And with anything that she said, actually. The thing that's, and one of the questions I saw was about what is shovel ready? Well, to be shovel ready, that means that you have done at least the pre-feasibility or the feasibility. So one of the big things that we've done in Transnet is to walk away from what was our project lifecycle processes. I had a meeting recently with an engineer who said that on your processes, Portia, a project takes 2 years longer than what it would take if you were following the EXA rules. So what we're going through is just basically adjusting our processes to EXA and making sure that we comply with Treasury. But there's no running away that the constraints that we then have is that in the well-meaning laws, right, that you end up having, you've got to comply with CIDB, you've got to comply with the triple PFA, you also got to comply with the BE Act. Then we've got the PFMA and its various regulations. So by the time you do the procurement, I think everybody's exhausted, even on our side. So one of the really big important things that we're trying to do is to make sure that we fast track that procurement. So a lot of the projects that we have in Transnet are shovel ready, and the ones that we've got more than enough. And so between the shovel ready ones and the ones that are at the back, which are coming up, there's significant. Now, here's a truth, that whether we like it or don't like it, it's a truth. We're going to build Point Terminal, for example, to expand Point Terminal in Durban from the current 200,000 TEUs to the 1.5, 1.8 million TEUs that we're planning. There's not a single construction company that can do this in South Africa. So that is going to have to be an EPCM, which is a foreign entity. But one of the things that we've done is that our project manager for the two because they tied the development of Richards Bay Port as well as the development of Durban, the Port of Durban into the hub that it should always have been, is one person. It's Dr. Bridget Gasa Tawoti. So one of the things that she and Betty have to deliver, and without a doubt, and they get it and they're on top of it, is that to the maximum extent that we can, we ensure that women are able to participate, young people are able to participate, and small, medium enterprises as well, and Black-owned companies, because often they get out. One of the statements that's also said in here, what we've been particularly careful about, is the notion that just because it's a big project, especially on the advisory, the engineering side, that some large company has got to be lead and not the junior lead. Now, we can't go and move people into leading consortia, right? But I can assure you, one of the big moves that we made was to say that the fact that your company is 50 years old is of no consequence to us. What is of consequence to us are the CVs that you put on the table. Now, the minute you shift direction, you can be a 5-year-old Black company, woman-owned, whatever. As long as you can amass CVs that have experience, that's what counts. So it's I suppose, for me, more than anything else, is that if all of us would bring an attitude to the things that we do, which is a lot more progressive and developmental, and not sort of like, and so make it clear to anyone who participates that the job, and in fact, there's something unique about this actually, is that if you look at the whole of Japan and you look at the whole of South Korea, that's how it was built. Large companies always shared with small companies. So enterprise development cannot be Transnet's job. That's not what we're best placed to do. We're placed to run trains, run ports. Our job has got to be that when we procure, we make you, the private sector, responsible for creating and sustaining these small companies. So you are going to see a lot more of that coming up. So John, just to come back, the notion that we are privatizing wrong, the notion that we are fixing our balance sheet and making sure that we're able to be strong on the other side, absolutely. The other idea is How do we increase dynamism in both logistics as well as in manufacturing in South Africa? The thing that we haven't spoken at all about, and you connect the two, if you have manufacturing, if you have firms, I mean, I can only go by the data that we get given by Stats.sa, right? So the latest data for which was November 2021 was saying that capacity utilization in manufacturing is at 78.9%. Now, in the old days when I did economics, when you hit 80%, you needed to start expanding your investments. And so the question becomes, are we in total, how much are we driving the manufacturing investment? Because, you know, Judy and Keta, those of you who are now even in development and funding, you help us on the infrastructure side, because unfortunately we don't get a grant from the state, right? We have to come back to you. And then you say to us, show us the business case and show us the revenue. Well, the only way that we have the revenue is if the factories are building, right? And they investing, because they invest, they move cargo, we're able to show that there's genuine growth on that side. So I suppose, John, it's a thing. I think we must be careful about too much creating an artificial divide between talking about what are we going to do to drive manufacturing in South Africa, because it's absolutely crucial, because we can't move empty containers. And the fact that we're moving dirt right now, fine, we're moving lots of it out of the country. But the value addition side of this equation is absolutely crucial, because let's be honest, most of the jobs locate themselves in those small, medium manufacturing enterprises. Thanks.
Thank you, Portia. Panelists and ladies and gentlemen, we are closing in, believe it or not, onto the hour. So I'm going to ask one more question, and thereafter I'm going to ask, right now, in fact, I'm going to ask the panel just to think about it, to give us a concluding remark for about a minute after I've asked the question, and the question is going to go to Zeph, the next question. But after that, I want you to think about the following, all the panelists. If there was one thing that you could magically command to facilitate South Africa's infrastructure rollout, what would it be? What would you think we would have to do this, to wave this magic wand, and that we can create jobs and we can roll out all the jobs that we have lined up, etc. Just perhaps just a 2-minute wrap up after I've asked Zeph the next question. Zeph, I'm going to ask you, and it was mentioned by Portia, this shovel-ready question. And what do you think? You said that, you know, the question is, there's an urgent need for projects in 900 billion infrastructure pipeline to be shovel-ready. How does the panel think that could be realized? From your perspective, what do you think we should do, or what do you think the government should do, or the private sector to do, to get these issues unlocked?
John, the big issue now is on the processes, the public sector processes that we put in place to facilitate infrastructure development. And it's not about ideologies. It's not about what the problem is or what we think we should. It's about the practicality of the processes that we put in place. Portia was mentioning the PFMA just now. I can't agree more. But you have to allow the infrastructure development process to happen. And the suggestion that I'm putting forward is that there needs to be reforms at process level, and I've said this earlier. If you're gonna push for infrastructure to lead the economic recovery, you need to make sure that projects are prepared in vast quantities, and you need to channel funding into project preparation. You need to find the right entities that can do project preparation at the national scale. I'm not talking about the Dbsa, at the national scale. But you also need to make sure that when the projects are brought up, for approval, the approval is agile. It happens on a high frequency basis. You don't limit the amount of approval spaces. You do it often enough to make sure that there's a lot of projects that are going out there. So we think that's important. And then the other point, which I need to repeat and emphasize, is using capable state entities to support government. You you can't keep on doing the same thing where we allocate funds and funds are not used. There's a lot of skill and expertise in the SOEs that can be tapped into to facilitate this. And let's make sure that we understand what the role of infrastructure development is. Let's make sure that we push this and we drive that road. And in our view, the question of economic access becomes important to push infrastructure for that. The question of making sure that local communities have access to infrastructure and local entities have access, to these contracts, it is extremely important. But also the big question is to understand whether we are doing this within the broader sustainable framework, so-called 2050 targets. So we need to have that in the processes that we do. And this, in my mind, will make sure that we fast track and we scale up infrastructure development.
Thank you, Zev. In fact, straight after I asked the question and said this is the sum up, you summed it up very nicely, so I'm not going to come back to you to ask you the same question again. Keta, what do you think from your perspective? How do we resolve this problem within 2 minutes?
So this is the, if I had a fairy godmother who could grant me one wish question. For me, it would be alignment, where there's a unity of purpose within government and also outside of government with the private sector. Zev touched on it a few times today to say within government, I think you've got the skills, you've got the capabilities. There's just is an alignment around the how. And so there's a lot of red tape, just trying to get stakeholder buy-in that is delaying the rollout of infrastructure and making things a lot harder than they're supposed to be. And quite frustrating, things that probably the private sector is not aware of. And so from even the infrastructure fund perspective, we are working very hard to align our stakeholders and to ensure that policies and frameworks and red tape is brought down for us to accelerate the delivery of infrastructure. And then on the private sector side, Judy also touched on it. Having worked, I would say for the last, so of 14 of my 15-year career was in the private sector and all of it in banking, in investment banking. I would say from the private sector perspective, and Judy touched on it, it's alignment around the common or unity of purpose, as I called it, where you sort of roll up your sleeves, get down from the grandstands into the field with us and start relooking and going back to the drawing board around how you fund social infrastructure, bring down some of your returns, how you better partner with government in terms of expediting rollouts and the rollout of infrastructure. So for me, I think it's that alignment that is missing. We're in a crisis, and if both ends could agree to a short-term 5-year plan where we truly partner and expedite the rollout of infrastructure, I think it would get us there. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Keta. Judy, your 2 minutes are up.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think I run the risk of echoing what has already been said. I think from my side, I think that, as Keta has said, I think absolutely there are skills at government level, but the skills are bitty, so you'll find that certain bodies are properly capacitated whilst others are struggling to know how to even deliver the infrastructure that they need. So if I had to wave a magic wand, I would basically say that I think that from government's perspective, so the public sector perspective, I would say that maybe we'd need to capacitate more evenly. such that everyone understand what is required to deliver infrastructure. The second one is around removing the regulations, the legislation, the processes that make delivering infrastructure cumbersome, that make it difficult for the public sector to even bring a deal that is shovel ready to the private sector. And I cannot echo Keta's point enough around better alignment between the public and the private sector. I think that the solutions here lie in the intersection of the public sector and the private sector. Both skills are required, and both are required to look at how infrastructure can be delivered critically. I think that the solutions are there, but I think that they do require innovation. We can't keep on doing what we did in the past that made us somewhat successful in delivering infrastructure. New models are required, new ways of working, new processes are required. And to get those processes, we need better alignment between the various stakeholders.
Thank you, Judy. Portia, it's customary for women to always have the last say, so I'm going to hand over to you for the last say.
Well, thank you, Judy. Thanks, John. So I also just, so for me, if my magic wand would not be one, would be three things. One would be standardization of specifications. Now, there's a risk, which means that, for example, you design the track in South Africa to do all the same, whether it's heavy or line or general freight or whatever it might be. The problem with that, you increase the cost. The benefit of that, because you've got to design it to the highest specification, obviously. The benefit of that, though, is that procurement is fast. Because every time I buy, I don't have to go back and say, oh, where am I buying for? Because that's what causes the frustration, by the way, is that every time you have to be re-specifying, as that if you have standard specifications, we deal with, I think there's a non-landler on the group who's posted non-landler, which is a little bit of an unfair statement. And I think we've got to start changing our verbiage, right? Not all of us in state-owned enterprises are corrupt, and not all people in procurement are corrupt. The reality of life, man, is the rules that we have, there's such a convolution. And in fact, because it almost makes it impossible to automate, by the way, the system, there is always going to be individual judgment. So the reason why we argue, my next point is the simplification of procurement processes, is that you would get faster to the point where you can automate it. And in fact, we're actually starting to pilot auctions. Now, an auction has a problem, because the point that you were raising, Judy, is that price starts to matter. I think it was you, Oketa. Then price is the driver, or who wins the bid. If you're large and you're established, you can be able to drive price. So one of the points that we've been trying to argue, and we say this everywhere where we can, is that actually what we should all agree to as South Africans, transformation is a requirement that we must meet as South Africa for us to arrive at a country at some point, because that's the only way that there's economic stability and there's stability. So why do we not have the courage to say, as South Africa, every single entity has to be a level 2 BEE, for example, because it's very easy to be level 1, but I know if I said level 1, everybody would die. So if we were all level 2, if everybody had to be a level 2, you shove your application into the system, you run, and a bot actually can produce an outcome which starts to increase the amount of equity. And lastly, the point that I think Penny is one of the people who raised it in the chat group around risk sharing at the table. If we simplified our processes, and we're struggling to get there, so that we selected you prior to finally signing off on the price, and we were able to do last round price negotiations with you now at the table, we'd be in a better place to do better risk reward sharing, so that we would be able to push back some of the risk to the private sector as well, so that both of us would share fairly on both. But as far as Transnet is concerned, there were a lot of people here saying, if you're interested about dealing with cable theft, why are you not listening to innovations? Well, I hope you've written to us. Then you can fairly say that. If you haven't, reach out to us and tell us what innovative solutions you have, and we'll look at it. But thank you very much to Creamer Media for the opportunity, and also the funders, and also just the 210 in the beginning and 175 people who've actually taken the time to listen to us. I hope it's been useful. Thank you.
Okay, well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. You have an open invitation to write to Transnet. I'm going to end off now, and I just want to summarize quickly what the last 2 minutes have said. Red tape reform, underspending of funds on infrastructure, access of infrastructure for all, alignment and unity of purpose, capitalizing on capacitating government, partnerships between private and public sector, and lastly, standardization. Thank you very much. If we've been unable to answer your questions or you didn't get a chance to answer them, please, you can connect after the webinar again. So thank you very much to the panelists, and I'm going to hand straight back to Shannon for closing off the session.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you so much to our panelists. That does actually bring us to the end of our webinar. I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our facilitator, John Matthews, for enabling this really robust and engaging discussion. Thank you also to our panelists, Portia Darby from Transnet, Zef Nhleko from the Dbsa, Keta Rantau from the Infrastructure Fund, and Judy Kurbis from RMB. We really do value your time and input, and thank you for joining us. Thank you to our partner, the Dbsa, and our sponsors, M&D Construction and RMB, for their support in making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join us for this discussion on upgrading infrastructure for economic growth. We hope you found it engaging and informative. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in due course. And if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you, stay safe and stay well, and goodbye.